to this recording, and I'm going to invite Reverend Hersey to introduce our next speaker.
Thank you. Before I do, I just want to let you know that Robin Belmont gives her deep regrets for not being able to speak. Unforeseen things came up and had to be attended to. One of the things that I've always wondered about as a chaplain is who do we refer people to? And even when we ourselves need help. And I find that God provides us with different people. And there's some that seem to rise to the top. And for myself, when I was searching around to find somebody to talk to, I went through the state and what they had to offer. And they have what I was looking at as a grocery list. Somebody gave me a grocery list. And there was somebody that rose to the top. I looked at a 50-mile radius of Buffalo, Syracuse, and New York City. And people have a various gifts and abilities, and God leads you to different ones. And I saw an individual that just rose right to the top. And not only that, but has a gift, what I call empathic as well, can really read people. And that was Dr. O'Connor. Not only did she do that well in reading people, but she's also a professor. And I had always believed very strongly in individuals that can reach over and touch the hearts and touch the people of those that are in with their religious faith, and for those dealing in the secular field. And I believe in my own heart that she has a special gift. She's a professor at Cayuga College, and if you look at her pedigree, she's got quite the training, and it's very modest what she put down for her training. So if you please look at that. And I believe before God that she is destined for something. I'm not fully sure what, but I see her as a bridge that can help other teachers or people becoming teachers and helpers and healers. And I believe that God's got something very special. So even after this presentation is over, I ask that you would just keep her in prayer, that she follow God's path, because I believe that she is an agent for healing in our state, in our area. So without further ado, Dr. O'Connor, I turn it over to you, and I just say thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much for those kind words. It's a gift. So again, my name is Dr. Vicki O'Connor. I'm an educator, I'm a researcher, and a psychotherapist. My primary research and education endeavors are surround attachment, trauma-informed care, and helping marginalized individuals and families overcome traumatic wounding and achieve dignity and enhanced quality of life through emotional and psychological healing. Incarcerated individuals, or those who have experienced incarceration in the families, are one of those populations that are an important concern to me in my work. I do have worked with many such individuals. And we'll talk about one in particular in a little bit. So I was invited to speak today by Reverend Hersey, and I'm honored to be part of this very important discussion today and to bring another perspective into the discourse surrounding historical and cultural trauma. We have listened today to Dr. Miranda and Dr. Kitchen as they have shared their knowledge and gifts and uplifting discussions surrounding the importance of knowing the impact of historical trauma. So my aim is to hopefully bring some additional focus into the discussion and bring awareness into the impact of historical trauma on the individuals and the families. We're going to go to a micro level. My discussion will. Originally, when I had been invited to speak today, it was intended to be an in-person format, and I would have held this discussion most likely as a roundtable, because I believe that it's really important for all of us to kind of share in the discussion, and the sharing of ideas and thoughts back and forth is very enriching. So I'm intentionally not sharing a PowerPoint today. I do have one that goes on with this discussion. If you're interested in it, I can send it to you, but I'm not going to use that today. We'll have a brief discussion, then I'm going to invite everyone in as though it were a round table, so we can share our discussion. We are all here because we have a shared belief that and a common goal about the need to help individuals who have experienced historical trauma. So from a research perspective, historical trauma has long been the subject of numerous studies. As a researcher, I've seen this a lot in my work. Historical trauma is defined as the cumulative emotional and psychological wounding due to massive chronic trauma that is experienced over the course of a lifetime and often across generations. So from the individual perspective, where I'm going today, historical trauma has been associated with specific responses and maladaptive behaviors that include depression, lowered self-esteem, self-destructive behaviors, often harm to self and others, suicidal ideations and completions, substance abuse, and the like. There's often an ambiguous grief that echoes through the lives of those impacted by historical and cultural trauma. And I hear that echo about this ambiguous loss in many of the people that I work with that have experienced this form of trauma. I would now like to begin my discussion about how trauma impacts the socio-emotional and physical development of individuals, beginning way at the beginning of life and how it tracks through a lifetime and across generations. I'll be talking about concepts such as the forms of trauma, PTSD, and attachment classifications. And we'll get into that here a little bit. So ideally, the family is, a child born into a family it's a safe and secure place for infants and children to be nurtured and to grow into securely adjusted people. My discussion today will focus on what happens when individuals experience chronic trauma, as is in the case of what we're talking about today, historical trauma. So the legacy of growing up with chronic trauma is the high risk of intergenerational transmission. And when I was doing my my dissertation research, that is in part some of the work that I studied was this intergenerational transmission of chronic trauma. So children who are raised in adverse conditions may be susceptible to either becoming perpetrators of violence or victims in their own right in the future. And so the more that we know about how this impacts individuals, the more aware we are, the better we can serve and help individuals to maybe overcome some of the tendencies that may lead them, to suboptimal living. So at the individual level, traumatic events are extraordinary situations that are likely to evoke significant distress. So it's important to note that there are two distinct types of trauma that I'd like to talk to you about today. There's a type 1 and there's a type 2. So type 1 traumas are often acute, singular traumatic events, such as witnessing a homicide, perhaps, sudden death or accident of a loved one, an assault, being involved in a natural disaster, or other rare, overwhelming events. But it's typically a singular event that may cause acute stress that, if gone unresolved, will develop into a form of PTSD. Type 2 traumas, also known as complex trauma, are defined as multiple, repetitive, and continuous traumas, such as physical or sexual assault, domestic violence, community violence, war, genocide, and the like. So often when we're talking about historical trauma, individuals that we may be serving or helping might have experienced this long-term chronic trauma over a lifetime. So complex trauma can have significantly detrimental effects on emotional and behavioral regulation and stability. And we're going to talk a little bit about emotional regulation today. The most pervasive outcome of untreated type 2 trauma is the deeper development of PTSD, as post-traumatic stress syndrome. So PTSD refers to a syndrome of persistent reactions following a traumatic stressors that is diagnosed when a combination of symptoms have persisted for a period of time and cause clinically significant distress or impairment in the social, occupational, educational, or other important areas of functioning. Most often these individuals have great difficulty with relationship. So how does PTSD present? I'd like to give you a little vignette of an individual. We'll call him Dixon. That's not his real name, but I want to tell you a little story about Dixon. Dixon, I came to work with him because of a severe anxiety, and I later discovered it was, he was suffering from unresolved PTSD. And his story sounds like this. He was born into a family, urban, single mother. He was one of 7 children in an environment, a neighborhood that didn't have a lot of resources, high poverty, high crime. And so from an early time, he grew up in this not so pleasant environment that didn't lend itself to providing much in the way of safety, security, or resources. He describes, he remembers having to find different ways to walk back and forth to school to avoid, conflict with gang members. He witnessed a very severe assault of one of his older brothers by gang members that he survived, but it was very traumatic for him to witness that. And in addition to that, mom, who was struggling, she had a that would assault her. So he was also, not only was he experiencing this trauma from the outside environment, but his home life, he was also being subjected to domestic violence. He himself was also physically assaulted severely by this individual. So at 16, Dixon finds himself as a father. His baby son was born to him at age 16. The 16-year-old mother, shortly after birth, abandoned both him and the baby. So here's the 16-year-old child with a child of his own. And remember the background that he's coming in. He has no clue as how to nurture and raise this infant. Mom, she does the best she can, but she's busy with her own, and she's still got young children of her own at home. So he's kind of left to his own devices there. And then when the child was 3 months old, he couldn't stop him from crying, and he shook the baby. And of course, the child ended up with shaken, baby syndrome, and injured him. Of course, authorities come in, the baby's taken, and Dixon finds himself arrested for child battery. And he is convicted, and he's put into, at this point, I think he was 17, he just turned 17. Now he's in adult facility, serving 6 years for child battery. And so it took a long time for him to be able to talk about the experience of being incarcerated at such a young age, and just the harm that came to him while he was serving a sentence. So by the time he came into my care, after he'd been released, and it had been a few years since post-incarceration, he came to me because of some severe anxiety. But he presented as someone who has trauma on top of trauma, layers of PTSD, right? He's unresolved PTSD from his family of origin and those experiences. PTSD from the guilt and shame that he felt at having harmed his infant son. and then the experience of having been incarcerated as a 17-year-old and having served out in an adult facility in that experience. So his story was most poignant. When I was preparing for this discussion, I thought of him. It's been some years since I've worked with Dixon. But his story sort of lays out what we're talking about, but what happens to an individual, what may happen to an individual who experienced this type of ongoing, lifelong chronic trauma. So as helpers, we're all here because we have this common goal of wanting to help. How do we help, right? So understanding that there is the behavior, there were the actions of the individual who might have, that, yeah, sure, we certainly don't want to condone what happened, what Dixon did, but we also don't want to forget where he came from and his experiences and his wounding. In our work with these individuals, we have to look at the totality, the wholeness of the individual in all the aspects. So I'm hoping that my talk today will help you as you go forth in your work and remembering, oh, this is another child of God. This is another individual who just went through experiences that might have been a little different from ours, right? They may need our help in helping to navigate through life. So how does trauma impact the early brain and personality development? We'll come back to Dixon's story as we discuss this. So in brief, attachment. And attachment is a neurobiological event that happens in the brains of infants at time of birth and into early childhood. And it programs us to be for connection and for relationship. It's important to note that all children attach, and we're gonna sometimes the attachment is not optimal, and we'll talk about the attachment classifications here in a few minutes. But in a nutshell, that's what I refer to as attachments, this neurobiological event that occurs at time of birth. So grave attachment is an inborn system in the brain that evolves in ways that influence and organize motivational, emotional, and memory processing with respect to significant caregiver figures, typically the mother, right, our father. So we are hardwired to seek proximity to our caregivers, right, and to establish communication and connection with them. This behavioral system improves the chances of the infant's survival. So attachment that's going on in our brains very early is literally a matter of life or death, for infants. Done a lot of research on this topic, and so the research has demonstrated that people who experience chronic abuse and neglect in childhood, they have problems identifying and regulating emotion. Such was the problem with Dixon. He could not regulate in that moment when his child was crying, when his infant son was crying, and his only outlet at that point in time was to shake the baby. So that's how, and one of the examples of how we talk about emotional regulation. So they have trouble regulating emotion, controlling behaviors and impulses, and focusing attention and learning and making decisions. Oftentimes they have difficulty, planning for the future, and very, very often they just have difficulties with relationship, which causes a lot of problems in life if you're not able to connect in a somewhat healthy way with others. So at the level of the mind, right, attachment establishes as an interpersonal connection that helps the immature brain to eventually organize its own processes. So all children attach, as I had mentioned. However, often the environment does not lend itself to what we call secure attachment. So I want to take a look at what we mean by attachment. This is just a real quick primer on this. This subject goes very deep. I could go on for hours because I love this discussion, but we'll keep this brief. So there are 4 major attachment classifications. Again, attachment being that neurobiological event that occurs at birth and continues through early childhood. From birth to about age 3 is when attachment processes are being embedded at the deepest level. So there are 4 classifications: secure, and then there are 3 types of insecure attachment classification. So the traditional focus, the research says, on the availability of an attachment figure, which would be a caregiver, assumes that the attachment relationship will serve as a source of comfort and safety, such as the case in securely attached individuals, right? So secure attachment occurs when the caregiver is consistent, warm, and loving. In the earliest moments of when the child comes into the world, communication and interactions are predictable and sensitive, allowing the infant to develop trust that the caregiver will be available to meet needs and provide love and connection. So the research bears out that secure parenting flows from parents who were themselves securely attached with their parents. But it should be noted there are 2 subsets to this group. And this is how I mean this. There are one subset of those securely attached individuals who are parented in ways that conveyed love and acceptance and connection. So relationship is easy. And those who have earned the secure state. And I'll talk to you about, because that's where we come in, right? I'll talk to you about what I mean by an earned secure state. These are the individuals who describe childhood experiences that probably would have likely produced some form of insecure attachment. However, they describe having a significant emotional relationship with a close friend, a partner, a family member, or some other adult, which allowed them to develop out of their insecure status. And this is important to remember because this process can take place at any point in life. Ideally, it happens, in childhood, but even into adulthood. If we have connection with someone who can provide us emotional support and provide us with some sense of some semblance that we are good and we are worthy, then they can change their status from an insecure to a secure status somewhat. Again, it's like on a spectrum, but we can help them improve their quality of life. Most importantly, we can help them improve with their relationships because we provide them that attachment orientation that they can sort of focus on, and we help them by helping them feel worthy and secure. And I hope that makes sense. So so it's important to remember that an insecure attachment is not equivalent to a mental disorder. I've had a lot of discussion about people think that just because someone might be insecurely attached in some way, that equates to mental disorder, and that is definitely not the case. Rather, insecure attachment creates a risk of psychological and/or social dysfunction. So for infants and very young children, attachment relationships are the major environmental factors that shape development of the brain during its period of maximum growth. Again, infancy, birth to approximately 3 years. Most likely, a secure attachment occurs when the families are not or have not been in the web of historical trauma. But again, it's important to note that even those individuals who have been caught up in that web of historical trauma they are not doomed to have poor relationships or, have these maladaptive behaviors due to insecure attachment. They can change. The brain is really amazing. It's like, so malleable, and so, it heals itself ongoing, and oftentimes just takes another individual stepping in a loving, guiding way to help the individual realize their own strengths, their own resilience, and that lends itself a lot to changing the brain and how they function. So it's important to talk about the 3 insecure classifications. The last one being the most important, because most likely that's what we're dealing with this discussion on historical trauma. But anyway, so there's 3 insecure classifications. Children who are exposed to an environment that is hostile, abusive, maybe there's some neglect, there's some community violence, there's some domestic violence going on, they have to manage a really profound dilemma. Oftentimes, like in the case of Dixon, not only was he dealing with the trauma of the hostile environment in his community, but he also had a very hostile environment in his home, right? And so the caregivers that they rely on for their survival are also the ones that are causing harm. And that is a source of great fear and terror due to physical or psychological abuse that they may be experiencing. So it lends itself to 3 forms of insecure attachment. The first is an insecure avoidant type. So again, this is I'm just giving kind of brief synopsis here. It goes much deeper than this, but just for this discussion. As insecure avoidant occurs when parents are not effectively attuned to their child's needs, meaning that there appears to be an emotional disconnect and lack of meaningful interaction and connection between child and caregiver. The child's physical needs may be met, but the caregiver appears often to be preoccupied, and they do not consistently meet the emotional needs of the child. Parents are, for the most part, emotionally unavailable, so to speak. So young children learn to be kind of avoidant, to lessen the emotional fear and anxiety and pain of never really knowing if the caregiver are going to meet their needs for survival or not. In later childhood, adolescence, and into adulthood, a pattern of emotional distance and rejection may become the central theme in their relationships. An insecure ambivalent orientation occurs when children have parents who are not attuned to the child's state of mind and frequently become emotionally intrusive during times when the child is attempting to explore their environment, for instance. So the avoidant is like the parent is not emotional, there's an emotional distancing. Ambivalent is when the parent is maybe too much, too involved, too enmeshed, too intrusive into the child's environment. So yeah, again, there appears to be at times too much focus on the child's emotional state, that at times the parent's emotions and mental states appear to interfere with their ability to consistently and accurately read the needs of their child. They're too wrapped up in their own emotional state to accurately attune to their child, to know what they are needing. So this confusion in the child causes anxiety and distress for the child, who remains uncertain and not only their own emotional state, they can't get a bead on how to regulate their own emotion, because their parents are unable to regulate their emotion as they're parenting. Now, the third type of insecure attachment, which is most pertinent to our discussion today, is a disorganized and disoriented type of insecure attachment, and this is very dire. This attachment occurs when children who have been exposed to extreme forms of abuse and neglect, community violence, domestic violence, and the like. It's been associated with serious family dysfunction. Children with disorganized, disoriented attachment have been found to have the most difficulty later in life. They will have the highest likelihood of clinical difficulties that are often lifelong if they go unresolved. They have the most difficulty in relationships, and unresolved trauma carries from parent to child through generations. Just a quick word on what we call trauma bonding. So what happens when people who rely on, what happens when people who we rely on for security and confusion and survival are the ones that are actually perpetrating the violence and traumatic acts against us. That puts somebody in quite a dilemma. This is causes a form of dissonance when the primary attachment figure, the mom, for instance, is also the source of the abuse. And so we're going at a micro level here. Dixon described often that not only was mom emotionally absent, but she would, like when her partner would physically abuse Dixon and his siblings, mom would remove herself from that. So that's sort of an example of you have to rely on someone for your survival, but yet they are the ones that are creating the terror. And so what happened with Dixon is he began to identify with the person who was physically abusing him. And this is a common phenomenon that we see in the clinical world. We work with people with PTSD. It's called trauma bonding. So I just kind of want you to be aware of that, because it's confusing sometimes for people who aren't aware of this phenomenon, because oftentimes, the person's inability to differentiate between a healthy normal and abnormal is skewed. So what we would consider as unhealthy and harmful in Dixon's world, that might seem normal because that is what he's been used to all of his life. So when he identified with the person who was physically abusing him, his mother's partner, we can understand that from the position of survival. So often you might see this. I see this all the time in my work with battered women, for instance. They will stay in abusive relationships because the abuser may be both the source of attachment and their pain and terror. But it feels normal to them because they might have come from family of origin and experiences where that was prevalent. So trauma bonding is something that you might want to be aware of when you're wondering, well, why would somebody who was abused and was harmed by it, but yet they engage in the same type of harmful behavior, or they're in relationships where they're continuing to be harmed. That's probably what is going on. It's, it can be ameliorated through some good therapy, but unresolved PTSD and trauma will often look like this, and you will often see that pattern. And you might be familiar with that in your work already with these folks. So, attachment styles will carry into their adult relationships. So, and thinking about this idea of the competing needs for connection and attachment with the threat of abandonment, this concept of trauma bonding becomes clear. So, as we discussed earlier, the neural development is dependent upon attachment. It's on the timing and synchronicity of attuned interaction with caregivers and the infant. So early life experiences are especially crucial in brain development. It's not, and the reason I say that is because it's oftentimes people believe that people can change their behavior just by thinking, oh, I'm not going to do this behavior anymore. I'm not going to use these substances anymore. I'm not going to, hit my spouse anymore, just by thinking about it. But the work of trauma and PTSD goes much deeper than that. Traumatic experiences in early life have profound effects on the deeper structures of the brain, which are responsible for the basic, regulatory capacities, emotional regulation. Now, in your work with these folks, I'm sure you see that often, that they're unable to regulate emotion, and to, you'll see a lot of anger. They go from 0 to 60 very, very quickly. They escalate very quickly. Very difficult to de-escalate. That is a feature of this phenomenon. So brain development is experience dependent, is what we call it, in which experiences activate certain pathways in the brain. So the reason I bring this up is because it might be difficult for someone to understand why certain events might activate a response. In other words, if someone, you've probably heard this adage before. There's a lot of work on, a lot of studies on PTSD about veterans coming out from war, and they'd hear a car backfire, and they'd hit the ground thinking that it was gunfire. They weren't really in danger at that point. It was just a car backfiring. But their brain, because of their PTSD, told them that they were in danger, and so they had no choice but to have that response. So that's something else that oftentimes we have to be very patient with as we work with these individuals, because they haven't unlearned those behaviors that they needed for survival at another time. So what does happen when a caregiver, when a caregiver does not act, it acts out violently toward a child during key development stages of the brain? We're kind of getting a picture of what that might look like. So one of the things that I really like to talk about, I think I've kind of talked enough about, how trauma will impact the brain. If you need more, on this, I've got so much information, but again, just not to beat this too much, but whatever is learned when we're frightened gets attached to our fear file in our minds, and so there's a neural firing that occurs in those with unresolved PTSD, and it plays out in ways that often look like very maladaptive behavior. But what I like to do is, in tying my work on attachment processes to historical trauma, the research will suggest very pervasive themes of loss, grief, isolation, often due to the death or incarceration of a loved one. There's another study, in addition to Dixon's story, there's another study that was especially poignant that I wanted to share today, that focused on the children of families experiencing historical trauma and community and domestic violence. And often these were children of had a parent or a loved one that were incarcerated. So in brief, this study had looked at the children that were in the web of historical trauma, and were experiencing, they looked for themes about, what comes up in the minds and the hearts and minds of these children and their experiences. And it's really, really kind of interesting that certain things came up. Like, for instance, okay, what the study was in brief is they asked them to draw pictures about their families, what their families looked like. So many of the images contained multiple themes that focused around loss and grief and fear. For instance, a 15-year-old male drew an image of his stepfather being taken away to prison by police for abusing his sister. This reflected both family conflict and loss. He stated about the drawing, "I'm mixed up. I'm happy he's gone, but I miss him." So remember the discussion we just had about the trauma bonding, right? "I'm happy he's gone, but I miss him." The comments here are also reflective of disruption in families and in the communities. In addition, this use mixed feelings about the event may also be suggestive of impaired emotional response associated with attachment disruption due to the loss of the parent. Also, the comments here indicate abuse was present in the home, consistent with previous research on historical trauma. Historical trauma often it's multi-leveled. It's macro, it's micro, macro, and meso. I mean, it's in the environment in all layers, in all the systems of the child's world. Isolation also emerged as a recurrent theme. It's often linked to family community disruption. For example, a 15-year-old female commented on her drawing in which she drew family members that were geographically separated by vast distances. And she said in her drawing, "I have to live with a friend because my dad is in prison and my mom lives far away. It's just I'm separated from my mom, my dad, and my grandma, and my two sisters." So loss is also associated with disruption of family. And that was a prominent stress theme reflected in numerous images of the participants in the study. As often is, and often they've experienced a death of a family member or someone that they knew. A 14-year-old female drew an image reflecting the loss of her cousin, who was killed in a shootout. So my first cousin passed away at age 20 last week. He was shot. We don't know who shot him. I've always called him my brother, and we are very close. I drew a picture of his funeral. So many of the, the reason I'm sharing the study is because it really drives home. It kind of brings to like a clearer focus on the impact of these individuals that experience this type of trauma. We can talk about it and we can have discourse about it, but I think it's really important that we look into the eyes of those who have experienced it with a deeper sense of caring and compassion, because we may not have experienced what they've experienced, but they can teach us a lot about their experience through that. If we just take the time to look at them as individuals. So I'm finding in my work that the individual impact of folks like this, that their wounding is palpable. I ask you, who do you see when you look into the eyes of men and women that you may work with? Do you see their crime? Do you see their behaviors? Do you see their defensiveness? Can you see behind that? Can you see through that to see their pain and their fear and their woundedness? And that's what I'm hoping for, that we are all able to see beyond their defensiveness and their behaviors, to see the person, who they are in their heart. So what I'd like to do at this point is to just kind of open up a discussion. I relish and appreciate so much the opportunity to share ideas back and forth with this topic. I love this topic. I love my work. I love people. And anytime that I can share ideas and learn from others about, what are their experiences working with these folks, and what have you learned, and what have they taught you? We learn a lot from the people that we serve and we work with. There are many gifts and lessons to be learned from their experiences. So I'm opening it up now. One thing I didn't get into was a little piece about resilience. I love to see the strengths and resilience in people who have endured historical trauma. And kind of want to get your ideas about what you've seen in the ways of strengths and resilience in some of the people that you serve and help. So that's one of the things I'd really like to hear. Yeah, so I'd like to open it up now to just a discussion. Thank you.
I have a question.
Sure.
Can there be healing from trauma? If so, how? And how can people like us who are chaplains facilitate that? I'm a Episcopal priest and I serve at Coxsackie here as a chaplain.
Mm-hmm.
So that piece of trauma and it's all that it conveys, can there be healing?
I believe without a doubt that there can be healing. Healing looks different for different people, right? And some people can achieve greater amounts of healing, but even a little bit of healing is better than none. But I believe that all people who've experienced trauma do have the capacity to heal in some way. I believe that we, as helpers, right, caregivers and healers, can facilitate that by just allowing. There's a sense of dignity that goes into the work. And again, I say that because in order for them to heal in whatever way they're going to heal, because that's an individual response, we have to allow them the space to do that by offering a really safe place, a trusting relationship with us, to be able to open up and talk about their experiences in a way that's going to allow them to begin to heal and feel as though they are worthy individual.
Point. But that seems to requires a kind of a long-term relationship with that individual, yes?
Sometimes, if we have the luxury of having time with that individual, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we get one shot at it. It might be one interaction that we might plant a seed, right? But the long-term healing, like in my case, when I work with my trauma-impacted individuals, it's a long haul. It's a long haul, depending on the level of trauma. But if we don't have the luxury of having a long-term relationship with that person, we take whatever time we have.
Thank you, Dr. Avoidant. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Chris, I think we have another question here.
Yeah, I'm not seeing it. Someone unmute yourself and give us a question.
Oh, yes. This is from Gillette. Gillette, are you on?
Yes,
was-
I am.
Okay.
Uh,
Want to
Doctor,
ask
can
a
you
question?
talk a little bit about vicarious trauma, please?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Gillette. That's a great question. And appropriate, absolutely, for our work. So thank you for that. I'm going to incorporate that into my next discussion. Vicarious trauma, for those who not be familiar with the term, is it's a secondary form of trauma. Like our work with individuals who've experienced trauma, who may have PTSD symptoms, we hear their stories and we have to hold their pain sometimes. And we hear some pretty intensive, incredible wounding, stories of wounding and pain. And oftentimes, if we don't check ourselves and take good care of ourselves, we may be subject to taking on some of that trauma, right? We may go home with it. We may begin to, to kind of worry about some of the things that we've heard throughout the day. Oftentimes, we have our own stuff that we kind of bring in, right? Everyone has experienced something. I mean, we are not, no one, I believe, has led the perfect life that hasn't lent itself to some form of lesson and pain, right? So we've all experienced our stuff. If we are not aware of our own stuff, we may be activated, triggered, so to speak, by the stories that we're hearing from others. This can lead us to feelings of depression and distress and anxiety. This is another form of vicarious trauma. So the way that what we need to do, and what I teach my students right from the get-go, and I also teach this to my patients, is that you have to be able to honor yourself in a way that you are caring for yourself. Self-care is so important, right? This is how we combat the risk of vicarious trauma in ourselves. And so in a nutshell, so I hope that has answered.
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Okay.
I have a question.
Frank.
Yes.
We earlier today, we talked about doing an assessment. And in psychopathology, we learned that we assess the person according to that person's cosmology, right? And part of that assessment, would it part of that assessment be knowing the person's history? That's the first part of my story. But we also have a great Russian psychologist by the name of Lev Vygotsky. I don't know if you are familiar with him. He talks about the scaffolding, the bond that is formed by the parents and the child. Does that confine to parent-child, or can it be extended to us as practitioners?
I firmly believe that can extend, and probably should extend, to us as well. Because in my talk about attachment and insecure attachment in particular, we can help them achieve better a sense of self and worthiness and relationship health by being that person I liked how you talk about that scaffolding, but being a part of that scaffolding that helps the individual out of their insecure attachment state, if that makes sense. We can help them feel, we can help them heal by our connection with them, by our support of them, and be a piece of that scaffolding, right? Because maybe the parents didn't, maybe there was something loose in the scaffolding because the parents were unable or absent, right? So we can kind of insert ourselves in there, fortify that in our own way to help them. I hope that answers your question.
Yes,
We
in
have
terms of the cosmology of that person,
Mhm.
again, would the person's story, history be a key component in terms of doing a good assessment?
Absolutely. I can't stress that enough. Very, very important that you understand the family of origin and what the experiences were for that person. You know, what was the family structure like? You know, what did he or she experience as being a part of that family? So yeah, family of origin and that history is a very important part of assessment. That gives you a lot of rich information about this individual's makeup.
We have a question from Carl. It says, for corrections chaplains, our interactions are usually transient and very short, as in a brief conversation while on rounds. Much of your presentation assumes longer conversations or weeks of repeated sessions. What do you suggest in this circumstance?
As I said earlier, sometimes we have one shot at it. And I believe that a seed can be planted from 1 or 2 brief interactions. And it's the way that what gifts are we going to give that person? We have one shot at it sometimes. It might be just a brief interaction, brief conversation that occurs. And you're always looking into the eyes of that person and looking to deposit something that says you are worthy, and everyone deserves dignity, regardless of what's happened in their life. You approach everyone in this way, and you can help them, even brief interactions. They'll remember that kindness. And I hope that helps.
Is there anybody else with any more questions? That was a good one.
Excellent. That was an excellent response. Yes. Thank you, Dr. O'Connor, for your words. They were just tremendous.
I'd like to interrupt just a minute. I'm sorry. I pressed the wrong button. I was trying to get in with my conversation and I couldn't.
Okay.
Hit the wrong button. I'm sorry, Charlie Grimm. Dr. Connor, are you familiar with Lisa Miller's work with spirituality and her work in the brain? And the latest book that I came across at my desk was The Awakened Brain and how spirituality, are you familiar with her?
Someone just the other day was talking about this, and it's so interesting. And I wrote that down, and yeah, I'm just vaguely familiar, but someone, as another colleague was talking about, the works and how, inspiring they were, so.
I don't know if I could just take a minute, not a minute, but less, hopefully.
Yeah.
In here, and I'm reading the cover, the inside cover of this. It says, weaving her deeply personal journey of awakening with groundbreaking research, Dr. Lisa Miller reveals that humans are universally equipped with a capacity for spirituality. And you talked about the brain in terms of some of the things you said. And that got my attention. And that our brains become more resilient and robust as a result. And you had mentioned about, being a little child and what the brain, has built into it for survival. And I'm just wondering if this is not an extension of spirituality that's in there. And I believe that 139th Psalm, I knitted you together in your mother's womb. And I put some things in there. Survival, but I think she's going to prove that there's other things in the back of the brain, and that our brain becomes more resilient and robust as a result. For leaders, she says, in business, government, truth seekers, parents, healers, educators, and any person confronting life's biggest questions, the awakened, that's with an ED, the awakened brain combines cutting edge science, which she's just discovered, not just, but been working with MRI studies to genetic research, epidemiology, and more, with on-the-ground applications for people of all ages, all walks of life, illuminating the surprising science, this is kind of interesting, the surprising science of spirituality and how to engage it in our lives. I think it's her research and what they're doing now. And the AMA now opening their eyes and ears and saying, I think there might be something to this. So I just thought I'd throw it out and see what you thought.
I am all for this. I believe.
Did you hear that?
Absolutely.
Am I not coming through?
Yeah. Can everybody hear me?
I don't get any response. Not hearing.
Yeah, can
Yeah.
everybody else hear me?
I can hear you, Vicky.
Okay, it must be
Yeah.
his. Yeah.
Yes, now I can.
Okay. And the answer is yes. I believe this is a really important component to our
Okay.
work with trauma. Absolutely. Without hesitation and doubt. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Yeah, because like I said, I was just talking to a colleague about this her work the other day. Thank you.
Do we have anybody else?
Well, I just wanted to say, Dr. Connor, yeah, this is Peter Cook, New York State Council of Churches. I really appreciate your presentation. It reminds me that probably all of us, as we're trying to help people deal with their attachment issues, that we're well to deal with our own attachment issues around, from our own childhoods. And I think that place is equally important.
Agree. Yes. Yes.
Totally. Definitely.
Okay.
One last one. I had one question or thoughts. Has this given you any idea of how maybe we can work together, spiritual and the secular fields, on thoughts on training individuals to be counselors?
I would be very open to further discussions with that. I think that would be such a gift and an opportunity for me. Anytime that I can,
We can bridge that gap.
Yeah. Thank you, Bruce.
I just wanted to say, just a comment on, even with that, yeah, and I thank you so much, Dr. O'Connor. And I guess I mentioned it a little bit earlier in just my comments of how we're traumatized and we're helping those that are traumatized. And it just go back to it takes a village, and it goes back to how we are our brother's keeper, and how we overcome by the words of our testimony. And I guess that's, the work that we are doing is, some things that may happen in our own past, we're able to help somebody else because we have seen God bring us out. And we know for sure that he would do it for them also, or we know someone. It's not always us, but we have the experience where we know someone. And I guess, that's really what we are doing. We're drawing strength from one another, and what we have, we are strengthening others. So, but I really appreciate that. That was very profound. Thank you, Dr. O'Connor.
And thank you so much, because I just want to extend a thank you to all of you for the work that you do. I'm grateful. I'm so grateful, for anyone who reaches out and tries to enhance the quality of life of another, helps to heal another. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Connor. I was really touched by that story about that young man, and it mirrored so many stories I've heard and seen right here in this jail.
Yeah.
Tragedies, and sometimes we have to, we disconnect the person, the historical basis of what's behind that crime,
Right.
and we really see that, and thank you. We're moving towards participatory defense right now with our program, and that kind of falls right into that.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful story. Thank you.
Yeah. Oh, you're so welcome. Yes. See them as they want you to see them. So thank you.
Thanks. Anybody else?
Like I said. Okay.
Guess, Peter, I'll hand it over
May
to you.
God's blessing upon you and your work.
Yes,
Thank you.
that's great.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much. And we're grateful for you being with us here today and for this thoughtful reflection. We are going to take a 15-minute break, and then we will have our association meeting at 3:15. If you've never been to an association meeting or weren't sure if this was for you, we'd especially like you to come at 3:15. This is really an association for everyone. It's not some little club of docs chaplains. It's the associations for all chaplains. And we would really value your presence with us to join us at 3:15. So let's take a break and we'll see you at 3:15.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay, great.
Take care. Bye-bye.
And we'll leave this on if people want to kibitz between meetings. So
Yeah.
okay.
All right, thank you much. There it is.
Recording.